Under a bridge in Central Park, a homeless woman solved an equation that would cost a billionaire everything. James Reed built a tech empire worth $800 million in just 7 years. He had the penthouse, the power, the prestige. But on one rain-soaked October night, he met someone who would shatter every wall he'd built. Her name was Alara, and she was solving quantum physics problems by flashlight while the city slept above her. When she corrected his billion-dollar algorithm in under 3 minutes, he made her an offer. Come work for me. Change my company. Live in safety. What didn't expect? She'd change him instead. Before we continue, if you believe in stories of second chances and love, I'd be so grateful if you'd take just a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment the city you are watching from. Your support helps us share more stories of kindness and hope. And if this story touches your heart, please share it with someone who needs to remember that circumstances don't define destiny. I love you all. Thank you. 6 months later, his board of directors would force him to choose. Fire the homeless girl who saved his company, or lose everything he'd spent a decade building. But by then, it was already too late. He'd fallen in love with the one person his world would never accept, and someone from her past was about to destroy them both. This is a true story of how brilliance met brokenness, and why the smartest decision isn't always the safest one. Our story begins not with success, but with surrender, on a night when even the rain seemed to wash away hope. It was 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in October, and James Reed was walking through Central Park alone. This wasn't unusual for him. The 42-year-old CEO of Reed Tech Solutions had built an empire on sleepless nights and relentless ambition. While other executives went home to families and warm dinners, James walked the dark paths of the park, his mind churning through problems that kept his company at the cutting edge of artificial intelligence technology. Tonight, the problem was particularly stubborn. His team had been working for 6 weeks on an algorithm that would revolutionize how AI processed quantum data, but something was wrong. The code kept failing at the same point, and none of his $20 million developers could figure out why. The rain started suddenly, cold and insistent. James cursed under his breath and looked for shelter. Ahead, he saw the stone bridge that arched over the walking path, and he hurried toward it. As he ducked under the curved ceiling, he realized he wasn't alone. A young woman sat against the far wall, her belongings packed neatly in 2 worn duffel bags beside her. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair pulled back in simple ponytail and clothes that had seen better days but were remarkably clean. What caught James's attention wasn't her appearance, though. It was a book in her lap. She was reading by the light of a small camping flashlight, and the title made him blink twice. Principles of Quantum Mechanics by R. Shankar. It was a graduate-level physics textbook, dense and mathematical, the kind of book that gathered dust on university library shelves. And she was taking notes in the margins with a pencil stub, completely absorbed, as if she were sitting in a comfortable library instead of under a bridge in the rain. James couldn't help himself. "That's pretty heavy reading for a Tuesday night," he said. His tone came out more condescending than he'd intended, the automatic superiority of a man who'd spent too long in boardrooms. The woman looked up, and her eyes were striking, intelligent, clear, and entirely unimpressed. "Heavy is relative," she said quietly. Einstein's theories seemed heavy until someone took the time to understand them. James felt something shift in his chest. It had been years since anyone had responded to him without deference or fear. "Fair point," he admitted. "I'm James." "Alara," she replied, returning to her book. He should have walked away. He should have continued his walk, gone back to his penthouse, returned to his insulated world. But something made him stay. "I saw the article about your company in the Wall Street Journal yesterday," Alara said without looking up. "The piece about your new AI algorithm for quantum computing applications." James was startled. "You read the journal?" "I read everything I can find," she said simply. "People throw away perfectly good newspapers. Your algorithm has a flaw, by the way, in the 3rd iteration of your quantum state modeling. You're treating superposition as a binary condition when it's actually a spectrum. That's why your processing speed drops after the 15 calculation cycle." James felt the air leave his lungs. This was the exact problem his team couldn't solve. The problem that cost him 3 weeks and hundreds of thousands of dollars in testing. How did you? He started. Alara pulled a crumpled napkin from her jacket pocket and a pencil from behind her ear. For the next 3 minutes, she wrote out an equation, her hand moving with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. When she handed him the napkin, James stared at the elegant solution. It was brilliant. It was simple. It was exactly right. "Who are you?" he whispered. Alara smiled sadly. "Right now, I'm someone who needs his bridge to stay dry. But I used to be a graduate student at Columbia, applied physics, before everything fell apart." She looked at him directly. "Intelligence isn't a privilege, Mr. Reed. It's just a tool. What matters is whether you use it to build walls or bridges." James stood in the rain-dampened darkness, still holding the napkin with Alara's equation, his mind racing through possibilities he hadn't considered 5 minutes earlier. He'd built his fortune on recognizing talent, on seeing potential where others saw only resumes and pedigrees. But this was different. This woman, sitting under a bridge with everything she owned in 2 duffel bags, had just solved a problem that had stumped some of the brightest minds he'd hired from MIT and Stanford. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, his voice gentler now, stripped of the earlier condescension. Alara looked past him toward the rain falling beyond their shelter. 8 months, she said. 243 days, if we're counting. There was no self-pity in her voice, just a flat honesty of someone stating a fact. "What happened?" James asked, then immediately added, "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to." She was quiet for a moment, deciding. "My mother died of cancer 2 years ago," she finally said. "Stage 4. The treatments weren't covered by insurance, and I made a choice. I paid for her care instead of my rent, my student loans, everything else. She had 6 more months with dignity and without pain. I'd make the same choice tomorrow." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of her physics book. "After she passed, the medical debt consumed what little savings I had. I was working 3 jobs and still couldn't catch up. Lost my apartment, lost my foothold. The streets don't care about your degree or your potential. They only care if you can survive them." James felt something crack open inside his chest, a space where empathy had been buried under years of corporate armor. "You have a master's degree from Columbia?" "Applied physics, yes. Full scholarship. I was 3 months from defending my doctoral thesis when everything collapsed." Alara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Turns out you can't write a dissertation when you don't know where you're sleeping that night." An idea was forming in James's mind, audacious and possibly foolish. But he built an empire on audacious decisions. "What if I offered you a position?" he said. "Consulting work with my development team. You'd have an apartment, a salary, everything you need to get back on your feet. In exchange, you help us innovate. You bring that mind of yours to problems we're trying to solve." Alara's expression hardened slightly, her shoulders straightening. "I'm not a charity case, Mr. Reed. I'm not offering charity," James said firmly. "I'm offering a job to someone who just solved in 3 minutes what my team couldn't solve in 6 weeks. That's worth something. That's worth a lot, actually." He pulled out his phone. 1-week trial. You stay in a company apartment. You work with my team. And we see if this works for both of us. If it doesn't, no hard feelings. If it does, we negotiate a real contract." Alara studied him with those clear, intelligent eyes, looking for the catch, the angle, the hidden cost. James understood her suspicion. "The streets taught you that nothing came without a price." "Why?" she asked simply. "Because talent shouldn't sleep under bridges," James said. "Because I've spent my entire career believing that the best ideas come from the most expensive universities and the fanciest zip codes. Maybe I've been wrong. Maybe brilliance is everywhere, and we're just not looking in the right places." He met her gaze. "And honestly, because that equation you just wrote is going to save my company millions of dollars. You've already earned this chance." Alara looked down at her duffel bags, at the bridge that had been her shelter, at the book that had been her companion through countless cold nights. James could see the war happening inside her, pride fighting against pragmatism, fear wrestling with hope. Finally, She stood up, gathering her belongings with practiced efficiency. 1 week, she said. I earn my place, or I walk away. No exceptions. Deal, James agreed, as they walked out from under the bridge into the rain-washed night. Neither of them could have known that this decision would change everything. That in 6 months, this moment would be the dividing line between the lives they'd known and the lives they'd choose. The city that had forgotten Alara was about to learn her name. But not everyone would celebrate that. The company apartment was on the 42nd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, and when Alara stepped inside the first time, she stood absolutely still in the doorway. James watched her face carefully, seeing the wonder she tried to hide. It wasn't a large apartment by Manhattan standards, just a one-bedroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. But to someone who'd spent 8 months measuring safety by the dryness of a bridge, it must have seemed like a palace. The building has security, James explained, handing her the key card. There's a 24-hour doorman downstairs. You're safe here. He paused. The kitchen is stocked. Help yourself to anything. Your first day at the office is tomorrow at 9. I'll have someone from HR meet you in the lobby. After he left, Alara walked through the apartment like someone exploring a museum. She ran her hand along the granite kitchen counter, opened the refrigerator, and stared at the food inside. Fresh fruit, vegetables, milk. Things she hadn't tasted in months. But it was the bathroom that undid her. She stood in front of the shower for a full minute before turning on the water. When the hot spray hit her skin, she sat down on the tile floor and cried, 8 months of survival finally breaking open into relief. The next morning, Alara stood in front of Reed Tech headquarters, a gleaming glass tower in the financial district that seemed to touch the clouds. She'd washed her clothes in the apartment sink the night before, dried them carefully, done the best she could. But she knew how she must look compared to the polished professionals streaming through the revolving doors in their tailored suits and designer shoes. She took a deep breath and walked inside. The stairs began immediately. In the elevator, eyes flickered toward her and then quickly away. In the corridors, conversations paused as she passed. She could hear the whispers, feel the judgment like a physical weight. By the time she reached the innovation lab on the 35th floor, her hands were trembling, but her spine was straight. James had assembled his core team for her first session. There was Marcus Chun, the chief technology officer, a sharp-eyed man in his early 40s who watched everything with quiet intensity. Victoria Ashford, a board member in her 50s, sat in the corner with her arms crossed and her expression radiating disapproval. Daniel Park, the vice president of development, looked at Alara with barely concealed resentment, his jaw tight. Everyone, this is Alara, James announced. She'll be consulting with us on the quantum computing project and other innovations. I expect you to treat her with the same respect you'd give any colleague. His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Alara stepped to the whiteboard, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Thank you for having me, she said. I've reviewed the specifications Mr. Reed sent over last night. Your quantum algorithm issue stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of how superposition states collapse under observation. But the same principle that's causing your problem can actually become your greatest advantage. She began to write, her hand moving across the board with growing confidence. Equations flowed from her marker, elegant and precise. She outlined a new approach to the AI infrastructure, one that didn't fight against quantum uncertainty but embraced it, used it as a feature rather than a bug. The room was silent. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes tracking every symbol, every connection she was making. Even Victoria's expression had shifted from contempt to something harder to read. Perhaps surprise, perhaps calculation. Daniel stared at the board with his mouth slightly open, his resentment now mixed with something that looked uncomfortably like fear. When Alara finished, she turned to face them. This approach should increase your processing speed by 40% and reduce error rates by half. The implementation would take approximately 6 weeks with your current team structure. Marcus stood up slowly. That's extraordinary, he said quietly. That's genuinely brilliant. But as Alara gathered her materials, she caught Victoria's eye. The older woman was smiling, but it was the kind of smile a predator makes before it strikes. Alara had learned to read danger on the streets, and every instinct she had was screaming that Victoria, Ashford was going to be a problem. Success, Illyria would learn, makes you visible. And visibility, in James Reed's world, made you a target. 2 months had passed since that first rain-soaked night under the bridge, and the transformation was undeniable. Illyria's innovations had already generated $340 million in new contracts for Reed Tech. Major corporations that had been skeptical of the company's quantum computing capabilities were now signing multi-year agreements, and industry publications were calling a revolution. The equation she'd scribbled on a napkin had become the foundation of a proprietary system that was changing how the entire tech sector approached artificial intelligence. But the numbers weren't what James noticed most. It was the way Illyria moved through the office now, with a confidence that had been buried under months of survival. She bought a modest professional wardrobe, nothing extravagant. Simple blazers and clean lines that spoke of competence rather than wealth. Her hair was no longer pulled back in a desperate ponytail, but styled with care. She'd gained weight, the hollowness gone from her cheeks. She looked healthy. She looked like herself again. Half the team had come to respect her, even admire her. Marcus Chun had become her strongest ally, often staying late to work through complex problems with her, their brilliant minds complementing each other perfectly. But the other half remained hostile. Daniel Park's resentment had only grown sharper as Illyria's successes mounted, each of her breakthroughs a reminder of his own limitations. And Victoria Ashford watched everything with those calculating eyes, waiting. It was the late nights that changed things between James and Illyria. The office would empty around 7, the developers and executives heading home to their families, and James and Illyria would remain, working side by side in the glass-wall conference room overlooking the city. They'd start with business, reviewing code, planning strategies, solving problems. But as the hours stretched toward midnight, the conversations would drift deeper. One night, as they stared at a projection of quantum pathways on the screen, James told her something he'd never shared with anyone in the company. "My father owned a small manufacturing business in Ohio," he said quietly. "He built it from nothing, employed 40 people, believed he was making something that mattered. Then the market shifted. Bigger companies undercut him. He lost everything in 18 months. James's voice was tight. He died thinking he was a failure because he lost money. I was 17. I swore I'd never be powerless like that, never be at the mercy of circumstances I couldn't control." Illyria looked at him with understanding that went beyond sympathy. "So you built walls," she said softly, "high enough that failure could never reach you again." "Yes," James admitted, "and I've spent 25 years defending those walls. Until I met you." She turned to face him fully. "You want to know the worst part of being homeless?" she asked. "It's not the cold or the hunger or the fear. It's the invisibility. People look through you like you're not even human, like your circumstances define everything you are and everything you could ever be." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "My mother died in my arms, Mr. Reed. I held her hand while she took her last breath, and I had exactly $632 in my bank account. The funeral cost $4,000. The final month of her hospice care cost $18,000. I chose to pay for her final months over keeping my apartment, over finishing my doctorate, over everything else. And I'd make the same choice again tomorrow, and the day after, forever. Love isn't a budget item," James said, echoing her words from months ago. "No," Illyria agreed. "It's not." They were sitting close now, blueprints and papers spread between them on the table, and James's hand moved almost unconsciously to cover hers. The touch was electric. Illyria didn't pull away. Their eyes met, held, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. This was no longer just about business. It had never really been about business at all. "Illyria," James started, but she shook her head gently. "Not yet," she whispered. "Let me prove I belong here first. Let me know this is real, and not just gratitude or circumstances or loneliness." James nodded, understanding. But as he walked home that night through the same park where they'd met, he knew with absolute certainty that he was falling in love with her. Not because she was brilliant, though she was. Not because she'd save his company, though she had. But because she'd shown him that success without meaning was just another kind of poverty. But while they were falling in love over equations and midnight conversations, Victoria Ashford's private investigator was digging deeper into Alara's past. And what he'd found in Boston would give Victoria exactly the weapon she needed. The magazine arrived on a Thursday morning in December, and by noon, every person in Reed Tech had seen it. The cover of Tech Innovator featured a striking photograph of Alara standing in front of the city skyline, and the headline read, "From homeless to high-rise, the street genius changing tech." The article inside was overwhelmingly positive, tracing her journey from Columbia graduate student to the streets to her current position transforming one of the industry's leading companies. It called her story inspirational, a testament to resilience and the democratization of opportunity. James thought it was wonderful. Marcus sent Alara a congratulatory message. Even some of the skeptical team members seemed impressed, but Alara felt a knot forming in her stomach as she read it. Attention was dangerous. Visibility meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant that people would start digging into the parts of her life she'd hoped to leave buried. She was right to worry. By Friday afternoon, Victoria Ashford had called an emergency board meeting. James sat at the head of the long mahogany table, surrounded by 11 board members, and felt the tension in the room like a living thing. Victoria stood at the presentation screen, her expression grave, a manila folder in her perfectly manicured hands. "I want to begin by saying that I take no pleasure in bringing this to the board's attention," Victoria started, her voice dripping with false concern. "But as fiduciaries of this company, we have a responsibility to examine all potential risks, no matter how uncomfortable." She clicked the remote, and a photograph appeared on the screen. It was a mugshot of a young man with hollow eyes and unkempt hair. This is Owen Matthews. He has a criminal record, including drug possession and theft. These charges are from 5 years ago, but there are multiple arrests spanning a 7-year period. James felt his jaw tighten. What does this have to do with Reed Tech? Victoria's smile was thin. Owen Matthews is Alara's brother. The room erupted in murmurs. Victoria continued, her voice rising above the noise. "Now, I'm not suggesting that Alara herself has done anything wrong, but we must ask ourselves, what do we really know about this woman? She appeared out of nowhere, literally from the streets, and within weeks had access to our most sensitive intellectual property. She has family connections to criminal elements. How do we know she's not using Mr. Reed's obvious affection for her to gain access to information that could be sold to competitors?" "That's absurd," James said, his voice hard as steel. "Every single innovation Alara has brought to this company is documented, verified, and demonstrably her own work. Her ideas have generated hundreds of millions in revenue. You're attacking her character because you can't attack her competence." Daniel Park leaned forward, emboldened by Victoria's presentation. "But how do we know those ideas are really hers? How do we verify that she didn't steal them from someone else? She was homeless, desperate. People do desperate things in desperate situations." Marcus' chin stood up, his usually calm demeanor crackling with anger. "This is character assassination," he said firmly. "Alara has done nothing but elevate this company. If we're going to condemn people for having troubled family members, then half this board wouldn't qualify for their positions. I know for a fact that at least 3 people in this room have relatives with criminal records or substance abuse issues. Shall we discuss those?" The room went silent. Victoria's eyes flashed dangerously. "The difference, Mr. Chun, is that those board members underwent comprehensive background checks before joining. Miss Alara did not. Which brings me to my motion." She looked around the table. "I move that we conduct a full background investigation into Alara's history, credentials, and associations, and that during this investigation, her access to sensitive projects be restricted." James felt rage building in his chest. "This is punitive and unnecessary." "Nevertheless," Victoria said coolly, "I call for a vote." One by one, hands rose around the table. When the count was finished, 7 board members had voted in favor of the restrictions, 4 against. James' single vote as CEO wasn't enough to stop it. "The motion passes," Victoria announced. "Miss Alara will be notified immediately that her project access is restricted pending a comprehensive review." James stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This board is making a mistake," he said quietly. Illara has given everything to this company, and you're repaying her with suspicion and prejudice. I hope you can live with yourselves. He walked out without another word, leaving the board members sitting in uncomfortable silence. Victoria remained standing at the front of the room, the photograph of Owen still projected behind her. Her expression was one of quiet satisfaction. The first blow had landed exactly as she planned. James drove straight to Ilara's apartment, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The city blurred past him, but all he could see was a satisfied expression on Victoria's face, the casual cruelty of reducing a brilliant woman to her most painful associations. He'd built his company on merit and innovation, or so he'd told himself. Today had shown him how fragile those principles were when they collided with prejudice and power. When Illara opened her door, James could see immediately that she already knew. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and there were boxes half-packed on the floor behind her. She'd heard from HR 30 minutes after the board meeting ended. "You don't have to say anything," Illara said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. "I understand how this works. I'm a liability now. The media attention, my brother, my past. I won't let you lose everything you've built because of me." James closed the door behind him and turned to face her. "What are you doing?" he asked, gesturing at the boxes. "Packing," Illara said simply. "I'll submit my resignation in the morning. Clean break. You can tell the board I left voluntarily, that there were no hard feelings. Your company will be fine. You'll be fine. And you?" James asked, "Where will you go?" Ilara's laugh was bitter. "I survived 8 months on the streets, James. I'll survive this too. I always do." But her hands were shaking as she folded the sweater and placed it in the box. James crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hands in his, stilling them. "No," he said firmly. "You're not leaving. You're not running. And you're definitely not sacrificing yourself to protect me." "You don't understand," Illara said, pulling away. "This is what happens. People like me, we don't get to stay in places like this. The world finds a way to put us back where we started. My brother's mistakes, my past, they'll always be weapons someone can use against me, against us." Her voice cracked. "I won't be the reason you lose everything you've built." "You're not the reason," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're the point. Don't you see that? I spent 15 years building Reed Tech, chasing success, measuring my worth in quarterly earnings and stock prices. And it meant nothing. Nothing. Until I understood what I was building it for." He stepped closer to her. "My father died believing he was a failure because he lost money. He never understood that his real legacy was in the 40 families he employed, the community he served, the kindness he showed even when he was struggling. I was so afraid of becoming him that I became something worse. Successful and empty." Illara looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "James, they'll destroy you. Victoria won't stop. She'll find more ammunition, more ways to make me toxic. You'll lose the board, lose investors, lose everything." "Then I'll lose it," James said simply. "But I won't lose myself. Not again. You showed me that success isn't in the bank account. It's in who stands beside you when the world says you should stand alone." He wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I'm not letting go of you." Illara closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, something had shifted. "You need to know the truth about Owen," she said. "All of it." She sat down on the couch, and James sat beside her. "He was my best friend growing up. Smart, funny, protective. Then he was in a car accident when he was 22. Shattered his leg. They prescribed him painkillers, and he got addicted. When the prescription ran out, he found other ways to get them. Then harder things." Her voice was steady, but James could hear the years of pain beneath it. "I tried to save him for 6 years. I paid for rehab 3 times. I bailed him out of jail. I lied to our mother to protect her from the truth, and it almost destroyed me." "What changed?" James asked gently. "I realized that loving someone doesn't mean drowning with them," Illara said. "Sometimes it means swimming to shore and hoping they'll follow. So I let go, told him I'd always love him, but I couldn't save him from himself anymore. That was 3 years ago. I haven't seen him since. She looked at James. That's the family Victoria is using against me. A brother I had to abandon to survive. James pulled her close, and she let herself lean into him. Loving him almost destroyed you, he said quietly. But it also taught you one of the hardest truths there is. Some battles you fight with your presence, and some you fight by letting go. I'm not letting go of you, Ilera whispered. Good, James said, because I'm not letting go of you either. They sat together in the quiet apartment as the city lights flickered on below them. And for the first time in months, Ilera let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found someone who would stay. 3 weeks passed in tense uncertainty. The board's investigation moved forward with bureaucratic slowness, and Ilera continued working on limited projects, while James fought behind the scenes to maintain her position. The media coverage from a magazine article had mostly faded, replaced by the next cycle of tech industry news. For a brief moment, it seemed like the storm might pass. Then Owen walked through the doors of Reed Tech headquarters on a cold January afternoon. The receptionist called up to Ilera's floor, her voice uncertain. There's a gentleman here asking to see you. He says he's your brother. Ilera felt the blood drain from her face. She stood frozen at her desk, Marcus looking over with concern, until she finally managed to nod and make her way to the lobby. Owen stood by the glass windows, looking out at the city, and when he turned to face her, Ilera barely recognized him. He'd gained weight in a healthy way. His skin had color, and his eyes were clear. He wore clean jeans and a working man's jacket, and his hands were calloused from honest labor. He looked like the brother she remembered from before the accident, before the pills, before everything fell apart. Ellie, he said softly, using the childhood nickname only he had ever called her. Owen, she managed. What are you doing here? I've been clean for 2 years, he said, taking a hesitant step forward. 26 months, actually. I work construction now. Steady job, steady life. He pulled out his phone and showed her a picture, a little girl with curly hair and a gap-toothed smile. This is Sophie. She's 4. She's my daughter, Ellie. Your niece. Ilera felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. You have a daughter? Her mother and I aren't together, but I see Sophie every week. I pay child support. I show up. Owen's voice was thick with emotion. I'm different now, Ellie. I know I can't undo what I did. Can't give you back those years I stole with my addiction. But I'm asking for a chance. Just to know my sister again. To let you meet Sophie. To be family, even if it's just a small part of your life. Every instinct Ilera had developed on the streets was screaming at her to protect herself, to keep the distance she'd fought so hard to create. But looking at Owen's face, seeing the genuine transformation, feeling the pull of the only family she had left, she felt herself wavering. I want to believe you, she whispered. I want to so badly, but I barely survived loving you the first time. I know, Owen said. I'm not asking you to save me. I'm not asking for money or help or anything except a chance. Can we get coffee? Can we just talk? They went to a small cafe 2 blocks from the office, and for 2 hours they talked. Owen told her about hitting rock bottom, about the court-ordered rehab that finally worked, about the moment he held Sophie for the first time and realized he had to become someone worthy of being her father. Ilera told him about their mother's final days, about the choices she'd made, about the streets and the bridge and James and everything that had brought her to this moment. When they parted, Owen hugged her carefully, as if she might break. I'm not going anywhere this time, Ellie. You don't have to trust me yet, but I'll earn it, however long it takes. What neither of them knew was that Victoria Ashford's private investigator had been following Owen since he'd entered the building. Photographs had been taken, and before the day was over, Victoria would have exactly what she needed. Later that week, Victoria made a phone call from her private office. Mr. Matthews, she said smoothly when Owen answered. My name is Victoria Ashford. I'm on the board of directors at Reed Tech, where your sister works. I'd like to discuss a business proposition with you. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 in exchange for a public statement about your sister's character and the circumstances that led to her homelessness. Specifically, I'd like you to confirm that she abandoned you during your time of need. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Owen's voice came back, hard as steel. You want me to lie about my sister? To hurt her for money? I want you to tell your truth, Mr. Matthews. Surely there were times when you felt abandoned. Lady, I don't know what kind of person you think I am, but my sister is the only family I've got. She tried to save me for years when I didn't deserve saving. And when she finally chose herself over my addiction, it was the best thing she could have done for both of us. So here's my answer. Go to hell. He hung up. Victoria stared at her phone, fury burning through her carefully maintained composure. If Owen wouldn't cooperate, she'd find another way. She'd already obtained recordings from his old therapy sessions years ago through her investigators' less-than-legal methods. Taken out of context, his words from those dark days could be twisted into exactly the narrative she needed. Owen's decision to protect his sister would cost him dearly, and Victoria's desperation was about to cross a line that would shock even James. 1 week after Owen's visit, Victoria Ashford made her move. She called an emergency board meeting with 24 hours' notice, invoking a clause that required James to attend regardless of his objections. When he walked into the boardroom that Friday morning, he knew immediately that something had shifted. The air was thick with anticipation, and Victoria stood at the head of the table with a leather portfolio in front of her, looking like a prosecutor about to deliver a closing argument. Thank you all for coming on short notice, Victoria began, her voice crisp and professional. I've completed my investigation into Alara, and I'm afraid what I've discovered requires immediate board action. She opened the portfolio and distributed packets to each board member. As you can see, I have documented evidence of continued contact between Alara and her brother Owen, a convicted criminal with a 7-year history of drug abuse and theft. Despite claims of rehabilitation, he remains a security risk. James felt rage building in his chest. Owen Matthews has been clean for over 2 years. He's employed, he's a father, and he's rebuilding his life. Alara meeting with her brother is not a corporate security issue. Victoria smiled coldly, perhaps not in isolation, but combined with this. She pressed a button on the remote, and audio began to play through the conference room speakers. It was Owen's voice, raw and broken. She abandoned me when I needed her most. She chose herself over her own family. What kind of person does that? The words hung in the air like poison. James recognized them immediately as the manipulated truth they were. Words taken from therapy sessions, stripped of context, weaponized. But around the table, he could see board members shifting uncomfortably, doubt creeping into their expressions. This recording suggests a pattern of character issues, Victoria continued. A woman who would abandon her own brother in crisis, who has criminal associations, who appear from nowhere and immediately gain access to our most valuable intellectual property. Gentlemen and ladies of the board, I submit that Alara represents an unacceptable risk to Reed Tech Solutions. Marcus Chin stood abruptly. This is a witch hunt, he said, his voice shaking with anger. You're taking a man's words from his darkest moments and using them to destroy his sister. Owen Matthews refused to cooperate with you, didn't he, Victoria? So you stole his therapy records and edited them to fit your narrative. Victoria's expression didn't change. The source of the information is irrelevant. What matters is protecting this company. What matters, James said, standing to face the board, is that Alara has done nothing wrong. She's generated $340 million in revenue. She's transformed our technology. She's brilliant, ethical, and dedicated. If we terminate her for having a troubled brother, we're saying that only people with perfect past deserve opportunities. Daniel Park, emboldened by Victoria's presentation, leaned forward. Or we're saying that we can't afford the liability. We can hire consultants to replace her innovations. We cannot replace our reputation. Victoria looked around the table with calm certainty. I move that we terminate Alara's employment, effective immediately. She paused, letting the weight settle. All in favor? Hands began to rise. James counted them with growing horror. 6 hands. 7. The motion was passing. SEO, I have the authority to override this decision, James said quietly. Victoria's smile was triumphant. You do. But doing so will trigger the clause in your contract that allows the board to call for a vote of no confidence in your leadership. You can save her job, Mr. Reed, but it will cost you your company. She looked at him with cold satisfaction. You have until Monday morning at 9 to decide. Either Alara goes or you do. Both of you together is no longer an option. The room emptied in tense silence. James stood alone at the window, looking out at the city where he'd built his empire, and realized that everything he'd worked for had come down to a single, impossible choice. James didn't sleep that weekend. He sat in his penthouse apartment, staring at the city lights, the weight of the decision crushing down on him like a physical force. On his desk sat 2 pieces of paper. One was his resignation letter as CEO of Reed Tech Solutions, carefully worded and final. The other was a recommendation for his replacement, nominating Marcus Chun for the position. He'd spent 15 years building this company from nothing, pouring every ounce of energy and genius into creating something that mattered. And now he was preparing to walk away from it. But every time doubt crept in, he thought of Alara's face. He thought of her reading physics by flashlight under a bridge. He thought of her quiet dignity, her brilliant mind, her refusal to be defined by circumstances. He thought of the choice she'd made to give her mother 6 more months of dignity, even though it cost her everything. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was making the right decision. A company could be rebuilt. But walking away from the woman who'd shown him what truly mattered, that was a betrayal he couldn't live with. What James didn't know was that Alara had spent the same weekend making an identical decision in reverse. She sat in her apartment, the one Reed Tech had provided, knowing she'd have to leave it soon. On her laptop was an email draft addressed to the board of directors. I hereby submit my voluntary resignation from Reed Tech Solutions, effective immediately. I do this to protect the company and James Reed from further controversy related to my personal background. I am grateful for the opportunity one was given and wish the company continued success. Her finger hovered over the send button. She'd survived homelessness. She'd survived losing everything once before. She could survive it again. But she couldn't survive watching James lose the company he'd built because of her, his empire, or her presence. It wasn't a fair choice, and she refused to let him make it. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. James walked into Reed Tech headquarters at 8:45, his resignation letter in his briefcase. His decision made. He rode the elevator to the 35th floor, walked past his office, and headed straight for the boardroom where Victoria had scheduled the final meeting. At exactly the same moment, Alara walked through the main lobby, her own resignation already submitted electronically to HR at 8:30 that morning. She'd timed it deliberately, hoping to spare James the meeting entirely, to make the choice for him before he could sacrifice himself. They met at the boardroom door. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, understanding dawning on both their faces simultaneously. James saw the determination in Alara's eyes, the set of her shoulders, and knew immediately what she'd done. Alara saw the resignation letter in James's hand and felt her heart break and swell at the same time. "You didn't," James whispered. "You were going to," Alara replied, tears streaming down her face. Before either of them could speak again, the boardroom door opened. Marcus Chin stood there, and behind him, the entire board was assembled. But Marcus's expression wasn't grim. It was fierce with satisfaction. "Before anyone resigns," Marcus said firmly, "there's something this board needs to see. Right now." He stepped aside, and Owen Matthews walked into the boardroom, carrying a folder of his own. Behind him was a lawyer, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and an expression that suggested she spent her career destroying people exactly like Victoria Ashford. "My name is Owen Matthews," he said, his voice steady despite the room full of powerful people staring at him. "And I'm here to testify that Victoria Ashford attempted to bribe me to lie about my sister. When I refused, she illegally obtained my private therapy records and manipulated them to destroy Alara's reputation." He placed a folder on the table. "This contains recordings of her offer, payment records traced through her personal accounts, and sworn affidavits from a private investigator she hired, who has agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity from prosecution." The room erupted. The emergency vote took less than 10 minutes. Victoria Ashford was removed from the board by unanimous decision, her face drained of all color as security escorted her from the building. The board's attorney announced that a full investigation would be launched into her actions, and criminal charges for illegal wiretapping and attempted bribery would likely follow. Victoria's desperate attempt to destroy Alara had instead destroyed herself. In the aftermath, the remaining board members turned to face James and Alara, shame written clearly on several faces. The chairman, an older gentleman named Robert Chun, Marcus's uncle, stood slowly. Miss Alara, on behalf of this board, I offer you our sincerest apologies. We allowed prejudice and fear to cloud our judgment. Your contributions to this company have been extraordinary, and your character has been proven beyond any doubt. He paused. We'd like to offer you a permanent position as Chief Innovation Officer, with full equity and a seat on this board. Alara looked at James, then back at the board. I accept your offer on one condition. I want to start a program called Reed Tech Second Chances. Scholarships and employment opportunities for brilliant people experiencing homelessness or economic hardship. People like people whose circumstances have hidden their potential. The vote was unanimous. Marcus smiled broadly. I'll personally oversee the program's development. But James wasn't finished. I have an announcement as well, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that had been building for months. I'm stepping down as CEO of Reed Tech Solutions. Shock rippled through the room. I'm transitioning to chairman of the board. James continued. Marcus Chun will become CEO. He's earned it 1,000 times over, and he has the vision to lead this company into the future. He looked around the table. I built this company because I was running from something, from my father's failure, from poverty, from powerlessness. But I've learned that running from fear isn't the same as running toward purpose. It's time I figured out what I'm building toward instead of what I'm building away from. 6 months later, the Reed Tech Second Chances program had hired 23 people who'd been experiencing homelessness. 18 were thriving in positions ranging from software development to innovation consulting. The program had been featured in every major business publication, and 3 other tech companies had started similar initiatives. On a warm evening in July, James and Alara returned to Central Park, to the bridge where they'd first met. The city hummed around them, indifferent and eternal, the same place where Alara had once sought shelter from the rain. A year ago, James said softly, holding her hand, I thought success meant never needing anyone. That independence was the ultimate achievement. And I thought survival meant never trusting anyone, Alara added. That keeping walls up was the only way to stay safe. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't kneel. This wasn't about grand gestures or performance. This was just 2 people who'd found each other in the darkness and decided to walk toward the light together. Build a life with me, he said simply. Not because of what we have, but because of who we are. Not because either of us needs saving, but because we're better together than apart. Alara's yes was immediate, certain, a word that contained all the hope and healing of the past year. They stood together under the bridge where a brilliant mind had met an open heart, where circumstance had collided with choice, where 2 people had decided that love was worth more than safety. 3 months later, in the lobby of Reed Tech headquarters, a framed napkin hung on the wall with a simple plaque beneath it. Intelligence meets opportunity, where it all began. Employees pass it every day, a reminder that brilliance can be found anywhere, that circumstances don't define destiny, and that sometimes the smartest decision is simply to choose love over fear. Owen brought his daughter Sophie to visit Aunt Ellie every Sunday. Marcus led Reed Tech to its most profitable year in company history. And James and Alara built a life measured not in dollars or achievements, but in the quiet joy of partnership, in work that mattered, and in second chances given and received with grace. If this story moved you, if you believe in second chances and the power of seeing people for who they truly are rather than where they've been, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their circumstances don't define their worth. Comment below with second chances matter. If you believe everyone deserves an opportunity to prove themselves. Victoria Ashford thought she could destroy Alara by weaponizing her past. But instead, Alara transformed that pain into a program that's changing hundreds of lives. That's what happens when you stand for what's right, even when it costs you everything. Thank you for watching, and remember, Brilliance isn't about where you start. It's about who you choose to become and who chooses to stand beside you when the world says you should stand alone.